Dr. Van Jackson is a professor of international relations at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He's also senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy and co-director of the Multipolarity Great Power Competition and the Global South Project at Security and Context. He's the host of the Undiplomatic podcast and the author of the Undiplomatic newsletter. He's written 5 books, most recently The Rivalry Peril, How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy with Michael Brennis. Also Grand Strategies of the Left, the Foreign Policy of Progressive World Making. So we're going to hear, I'm excited to hear from Van about kind of his perspective on this question. Van, take it away whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with kind of the biggest of pictures, the zoom out perspective, if you will, and try to make sense of our moment in a way. So we're all probably familiar with like the greatest hits of American militarism since Trump 2.0 came to office. Just like the wave top descriptions, $1 trillion Pentagon budget, right? 54% of which has gone to private sector contracts. On Israel, it's almost impossible to be worse on Gaza than Biden, but Trump kind of is, In the past 6 months, he's authorized $3 billion in weapon sales, $7 billion more planned in sale of guns and bombs and missile like technology, like associated systems. The Trump administration reversed the Biden administration's hold on using 2,000-pound bombs, and the Trump administration revoked the National Security Memorandum 20, NSM 20, which had, I mean, it's feckless, but it had required certifications from countries that receive U.S. weapons that like they were using them in line with international law, which is becoming a bit of a joke, but like at least the memorandum requirement was there. It's no longer there. The Trump administration rescinded it. And then, of course, the U.S. and Israel have launched bombing campaigns of Iran. The U.S. still has troops in every Middle Eastern country except for Iran and sort of Yemen, depending on how we count it. Trump famously has an ongoing threat to annex Greenland, the Panama Canal. It's possibly a troll, but even Canada. And then he's leveraging tariffs. Like we saw this week, right? On EU countries to get a vague commitment, or he got a vague commitment for, quote, hundreds of billions of dollars of arms sales to Europe, which is going to require imposing austerity on European governments in order to pay for it. And in the UK, that already is happening. In East Asia, interestingly, not a lot has changed, and that's a terrible thing, right? From the previous administration, because we have somewhere around 80,000 troops in the region as part of a kind of containment or China encirclement strategy. In the Pacific Islands region, which is apart from East Asia, next to it, a military buildup is happening in Guam and Micronesia, which are in fact colonial relations of the US that we're exploiting as part of our military strategy. They can't resist our military buildup because they don't have self-determination for the most part. And all of that was going on before Trump. All of that is going on now during Trump. And we have to add ICE to this, of course, right? ICE is Trump's secret police, effectively putting the Proud Boys on the payroll now. But the thing to really stress about that is that the domestic security state is now assembling a global security archipelago of internment camps, which is a kind of, remix version or an interpolation of the black sites that the Bush administration used in the war on terror. So that is like a partial list of nightmares. That list of nightmares was happening under Biden and Obama to a large extent, but Trump is kind of pushing it in certain areas, right? He's pushing it on Gaza. He's pushing it on Iran. He's pushing it on, of course, ICE and on larding the military-industrial complex, which I think is actually the most important and consequential one of these things. But otherwise, this list of nightmares is kind of a bipartisan continuity. And then the question becomes, because of that, like, why is this happening, right? And I think for that, we got to briefly conceptualize what the national security state thinks it's doing under Biden versus Trump. And my shorthand distinction for this would be like a liberal primacy versus an imperialist primacy as US grand strategy. So for more than 40 years, US grand strategy has come closest to what security scholars would refer to as primacy. It's an ideal type like model of grand strategy. Primacy is a zero-sum strategy of structural domination, and it has three key attributes, right? One is it requires an extreme imbalance of power in the world system, favoring the US. Two is it prioritizes other great powers as the foremost threat to worry about. And then three, it insists on containing or diminishing even hypothetical challenges to US power hoarding, even if it means using force, even if the rising power is an ally. So think like Japan in the 1980s in the Yellow Peril, right? And all three of those attributes were part of US thinking across every presidency since Reagan, um, all the way up to Biden. And they're also present now. MAGA foreign policy is zero sum. It seeks a favorable imbalance of power. It prioritizes China, which is the other main great power, as the biggest foreign threat. And then, even though it's doing it kind of incompetently and erratically, it is trying to curb Chinese power. So, what's different, I guess, is that MAGA foreign policy has more going on in it than just these primacy features, right? So, with most past presidents, primacy was dressed up in liberal rhetoric and alliances and multilateral institutionalism, but it still had these three key attributes at its core: favorable imbalance of power, great power threats, keeping rising powers down, right? With Trump, the liberal adjective on primacy is obviously gone. We don't even pretend to have it. And in place of that adjective is imperialist geopolitics. So the aims of a primacy grand strategy are kind of being kept alive or tended to by the national security state, by think tankers, by a lot of members of Congress. But on top of that, Trump is doing, not by design, I think by happenstance, like he's doing a classical imperialist foreign policy. And the reason I can say that is because, again, like with primacy, we can kind of identify what are the objective features that we look for in an imperialist foreign policy. Well, territorial expansionism, rewriting international rules, carving out spheres of influence with other great powers where you collude together, not to just cooperate, cooperation is good, but to dispossess or exploit third parties, right? And then crucially, in an imperialist foreign policy, what Kwame Nkrumah would have called neocolonialism, which is dictating terms of unequal exchange about trade, about finance, about resource extraction with smaller, weaker powers. And that is, in fact, most of the powers in the world relative to the US. So that's what we could call an imperialist foreign policy. That's what we're seeing in spades from Trump, even though he's just kind of like a racist vessel for other interests. And even though a lot of that stuff was going on before Trump, now it's being elevated to a kind of doctrine, like it's being intellectualized and it's being put in service of a white nationalist order building project at home and abroad. And you would think that like the national security state people would chafe at that. And I think like at a rhetorical level, maybe they do, but the national security wonks they've latched onto like a phrase. I've seen them write about this to fit what they do in with this imperialist doctrine, which is minerals for military assistance. So you let us extract your natural resources or dispossess your land, and then we provide you with military assistance or tariff relief or funding for an ICE prison. And that's happening on pretty much every continent, and it's happening in the Pacific Islands too. And then the question becomes, of course, like, why, right? I think this is all a morbid symptom of a crisis of capital accumulation and of declining American hegemony. And I'll explain what I mean by that because it sounds very big. But like That cause, right, a crisis of accumulation and declining hegemony, that cause of our current militarism, it predates Trump, and it's actually what gives rise to Trump. Like those are the conditions that Trumpism is kind of responding to in a way and accelerating. And so I didn't bring the charts with me, but we have had in the capitalist world system for decades a secular decline in global growth, right? Even though we've had record level amounts of productivity since the 1970s. And then we reached a point in the 2000s where what we called neoliberalism now could no longer tell a win-win kind of positive sum story about the global economy. And the financialization of the economy, which was a direct response to the declining growth rates of the 70s, it led to a series of speculative bubbles and financial crises, the latest of which, or the biggest of which, was the 2008 global financial crisis, which is something we still haven't recovered from, right? So why am I talking about that in a, discussion about militarism? The reason is because even aside from what the national security state thinks it's doing, there are two like major tributaries feeding American militarism, and they are both downstream of a crisis of capital accumulation. So one is that I think we know this. America is the land of surplus capital, of wealth hoarding. Since the financial crisis in '08, venture capital firms have had like fewer and fewer places to put their tens, hundreds of billions of dollars that showed the promise of unicorn level returns on investment. At some point, they realized that investing in, you know, apps isn't going to do it, right? And so a low growth world has no place to stash your cash that's surplus. So all the tech VCs, venture capital firms, they bet on Uncle Sam, right? Their surplus accumulation has been going more and more into the military industrial complex. And that's Anduril, that's SpaceX, that's OpenAI, that's Palantir, whose valuation has gone up 400% in the last 7 months, right? That's also what all the AI hype ultimately is. Like AI is channeling $500 billion of VC investments, and it's not even a profitable technology for the most part, right? The caveat to that is unless you sell it to the Pentagon and to ICE and the IDF, because they'll buy it, right? Now, if the super rich capitalist class thinks it can make money off of the national security state and off of military Keynesianism, do you think that your country is more or less likely to be predatory warmongers? And I think it's a rhetorical question, right? I think the verdict is in. And this is why the great power competition, China threat stuff matters so much, right? A high technology military is only necessary, it's only like justifiable if you plan to fight a high technology adversary. The $1 trillion war machine and the Silicon Valley bet on military production and a military, client, consumer, it has no justification except for hypothetical war with China. Trump doesn't even want to fight China, but the system that he's sitting on top of requires the China threat to justify itself. And then the other tributary, separate from the tech, feeding American militarism is about the specific imperialist form of US foreign policy. So a world of low growth makes capitalists turn toward the use of state power to secure a larger share of a shrinking global economic pie. We're seeing that in China, but we're obviously seeing that in spades in the US, right? So the state secures the bag for its capitalists through what you might call primitive accumulation, a kind of bare knuckle profit seeking. So imperialist foreign policy is how you do primitive accumulation, land grabs, dispossession, a focus on resource extraction, tribute payments, colonial erasure, frontier making. These are evil things, but they are ways also of unlocking or redistributing upward value in a world where capitalism has become too competitive to get rich off of just like wage labor exploitation. And so the tendency of the declining rate of profit and the fact of a low growth world gives rise to state capitalism, which requires a nationalist ideology to bolster it, to fuel itself. Nationalist state capitalism puts you in conflict with others, especially when those others are mirror imaging you. That's what makes Sino US competition an inter-imperial rivalry within capitalism. And that is the biggest source of the imperialist form of US foreign policy at the moment, right? So you have this national security state quest for primacy. You have the white nationalist order building project. You have the tech bros and the VCs who are leaning into jingoism and patriotism and militarism because it pays. But that also means you have to have the China threat, consequently, which they also promote. And then you have imperialist foreign policy trying to extract new value from a world of low growth. So I guess what I'm saying is like the militarism of our moment is in so many ways overdetermined. And then that's probably like as much as I should say for now. Thanks.
Teach-ins like this are a useful way to share expert perspectives with our communities and organizing groups, and we want to empower you to organize your own. We started the Teach-In Network as campus protests were being villainized across the country, as Bill just mentioned. And so our goal is to help make organizing a teach-in safe and easy. We provide resources and connect you with vetted expert speakers. The network is comprised of toolboxes that include primers, presentations, videos, and more. And of course, access to experts, many of whom are listed on our website, which I will post in the chat now. Here's a link with many of our speakers who have already agreed and are waiting on emails from us asking them to join a teach-in. We just organized an in-person one in Tucson that's going to be happening in a couple weeks. So I urge you, even if you never have, to take the next step and organize your own teach-in for your local organizing group or student group or whoever you meet with regularly or organize with. Please reach out to me via the Teach-In Network website, which you can get to through that link I just posted, or email me anytime at ryan@rootsaction.org if you want to organize with us. Thank you, and back to you, Emma Claire.